Welcome to a deep dive into Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. It's a book that's less about predicting the future and more about, I think, holding up a mirror to his own time.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how Bradbury uses this extreme scenario, right? This extreme scenario of book burning to kind of explore anxieties about technology, mass media, conformity, all these things that were swirling around him in the 1950s.
Right, and we're going to unpack all of that, this Bradbury's cautionary tale today. And we're using a few sources. We've got the novel itself, of course, but also a collection of Bradbury's interviews and articles, along with some critical perspectives on the novel's impact.
Yeah, having those extra sources, I think, gives us a much broader view of the anxieties that Bradbury was grappling with. I mean, you can see the Cold War, McCarthyism, even the rise of television. It all kind of seeps into the narrative in really interesting ways.
It's like he took those anxieties and just dialed them up to 11, right? Creating this world where just owning a book is against the law. And firemen, like our protagonist, Guy Montag, they go and torch them on site. Um, what would you say is the most striking thing about this society that Bradbury creates?
You know, the thing that really stands out to me is how he portrays this population that's hooked on instant gratification and really shallow entertainment. Like you've got giant TV walls, people have got music constantly playing in their ears. It's a world that's very deliberately designed to prevent any kind of deep thought or dissent.
It's like everyone's living in a constant state of distraction.
Yeah, exactly. He even describes it at one point as an electronic ocean of sound that people are just willingly drowning themselves in.
And we see how that plays out with the characters, right?
Hmm.
Especially with Montag's wife, Mildred. She's just completely plugged into this world and absolutely terrified of anything real, anything challenging.
Oh, she's a cautionary figure for sure. Her constant need for stimulation, her inability to really connect with her own emotions, it's a stark warning about the potential pitfalls of technology, you know?
And then there's that really chilling scene where Montag finds those sleeping pills next to Mildred after she overdoses.
Right, right.
It's
Yeah.
a reminder that this pursuit of empty pleasure isn't just mindless, it can be really, really dangerous.
Absolutely.
But what I find interesting is that even in this bleak dystopian world, Bradbury still offers us these little glimmers of hope,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the most prominent example of that is Clarice, right? This young woman who just embodies curiosity and independent thought. She challenges Montag's assumptions and really opens his eyes to the beauty, the wonder that's been lost in this world.
Yeah, she really is like a breath of fresh air in this oppressive society. And you can tell that Bradbury admires her. The
Hmm.
way he describes her, it's with such care. Like he talks about her face being like the dial of a small clock or
Hmm.
all certainty in knowing what it has to tell of the night passing swiftly on.
That's beautiful.
It's just lovely, lovely writing. And she's a catalyst, right, for Montag's transformation. He starts questioning everything, even stealing books from the fires he's supposed to be setting.
Right. Right.
What I found really interesting is how Bradbury describes Montag's internal conflict. You know, he says at one point he felt drawn to the knowledge they contained, but he was also scared of the consequences. He even mentions how he feels like his smile is gone and he's lost without it. It's as if his old self, the one who never questioned anything, is just fading away.
And it's that struggle, that internal struggle that ultimately leads him to Faber,
Faber.
this retired professor, a secret keeper of
He
books.
kind of becomes this mentor, right?
Yeah.
This guide for Montag. And it's interesting because he doesn't just tell him about, books are important for information. He talks about how they help you develop empathy, critical thinking skills.
Yeah. And he says it in such a beautiful way. He says, books were only one type of receptacle where we stored a lot of things we were afraid we might forget. Like it wasn't about the objects themselves, right? It was about the ideas they contained. And he talks about how they stitched the patches of the universe together into one garment for us. What is it about that idea that books hold more than just words? Why does that still resonate with us even today?
I think it's that feeling that books can connect us to something bigger than ourselves, across time and across experience.
Right.
And that connection, that ability to kind of step into someone else's shoes, see the world through their eyes, it just feels so important, especially today when everything feels so, I don't know, fragmented and overwhelming. And you see that desire for connection playing out, I think, in Montag's relationship with Faber too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, Faber gives him a way to push back against the suffocating conformity of this world,
Hmm.
even if it's just, as he says, like a whisper against a roar.
It's a powerful image.
Right.
A whisper against a roar. It makes you think about those little ways we all resist, maybe the pressure to conform in our own lives.
Mhm.
It's interesting, though, because even Faber, he's not completely gung-ho about resistance, right?
Right.
Like when Montag suggests printing more books,
Oh, yeah.
Faber actually pushes back, calls him a hopeless romantic, right? He's like, just having more books won't solve everything.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point because Bradbury isn't just advocating for books as objects, right?
Right.
He's advocating for engaging with ideas, for critical thinking. Like, just having access to knowledge isn't enough. We have to actively choose to learn, to grapple with difficult questions, even when they make us uncomfortable.
And for Montag, that internal struggle really comes to a head when he tries to share some of this, the poetry he's found with Mildred and her friends. It's like he's desperate to break through those walls of their digital sea, to sparks kind of real connection.
And that scene, the one where he's reading the poetry to them, it's such a turning point in the novel, I think. Because it exposes the emptiness of their lives, but also, the danger of suppressing your emotions like that for too long.
It really does.
Bradbury even describes one of the women, Mrs. Phelps, sobbing uncontrollably, but completely unable to explain why the words affect her so
Yeah,
much.
it's like the poetry just cracks open something inside of her, something she's been trying to bury for years.
It's that raw human response that their entire society is designed to suppress. It reminds us that even in this world, right, this world obsessed with instant gratification and mindless entertainment, the human need for emotional connection, for intellectual stimulation, it can't be completely extinguished.
And it makes you think, like, are there ways that we might be suppressing those needs in our own lives without even realizing it?
It's a question worth asking ourselves for sure,
Yeah.
especially when you consider how Bradbury portrays the consequences of that kind of suppression,
Yeah.
right?
And the consequences lead us, of course, to the novel's really dramatic confrontation between Montag and Beatty, the fire captain.
Right.
He represents in a lot of ways the oppressive ideology of this world, and Bradbury gives him some of the most chilling lines in the whole book.
Beatty is such a fascinating character, though, because he's clearly intelligent, well read, even, but he's chosen to embrace the system that destroys knowledge.
He does. And he even goes so far as to justify what they're doing.
Yeah.
Like the firemen, he says they're um, custodians of our peace of mind, protecting
Yeah.
people uh, from the rightful dread of being inferior, I think is how he puts it.
Yeah. And what's so disturbing is that there's this seductive logic to it,
Yeah.
This appeal to just remaining ignorant, not having to face difficult questions or uncomfortable truths.
Right. And his final lecture to Montag, just before the house is burned,
Oh, I know.
it's full of this twisted logic. He's talking about how technology, mass entertainment, they've created this world where people are choked so damn full of facts that they feel stuffed, but absolutely brilliant with information.
Right. Like you can drown in information just as easily as you can drown in entertainment. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And you know what makes Beatty even more frightening
What's that?
is that he's not just some, one-dimensional villain.
Right.
There are these moments where you can almost sense a flicker of regret, a hint of that intellectual curiosity that he's clearly suppressed.
It makes him all the more unsettling, right? Because he represents the possibility of intelligence being used not for good, but for perpetuating ignorance, which is a sobering thought that knowledge, intellect can be twisted to serve such destructive ends.
Yeah, it's like he becomes this kind of cautionary tale within a cautionary tale.
Absolutely.
He shows us what can happen if we let our intellect get totally divorced from, empathy and compassion.
And speaking of internal landscapes, after that confrontation with Beatty, Montag has to flee the South, right? He goes out into the wilderness. Yeah, and it's out there in that kind of desolate landscape that he encounters this group of, well, they're intellectuals living on the fringes of society,
Right.
led by a man named Granger. And they've dedicated themselves to preserving knowledge, but they do it in a really interesting way. They memorize entire books.
Wow. Imagine like carrying around a whole book, a whole story inside your own mind. It's such a powerful image and it speaks to like the enduring power of ideas, even when the world is trying to destroy them.
And I think what's really striking is that these book people, as they're called, they don't see themselves as just like hoarding knowledge. They see themselves as vessels. They're carrying these stories forward because they hope one day they can rebuild a society that actually values them.
It makes you wonder, what book would you choose to carry? You know, if you had to pick just one to safeguard for the future, what stories do we hold on to that tightly?
Right. It really makes you think about what matters.
It does. And, we were talking earlier about some of the additional sources that we have for this deep dive.
Yeah.
And there was that one quote from Bradbury that really stuck with me about the dangers of technology. I think he was talking about these electronic tides.
Oh, yes. Yes. He said, so much depends, of course, on what the individual hears when he gives himself over to the electronic tides breaking on the shore of his seashell. And the seashell was that little earbud thing they used in the book.
Right.
And, Bradbury, he wasn't anti technology, but he worried that instead of like expanding our minds, these tools might actually end up narrowing them, that they just feed us a constant stream of, as he put it, bias, hatred, fear, prejudice, nightmare, lies, half-truths, and suspicions.
It's kind of unsettling how relevant that feels right now. When you think about how bombarded we are with information from all sides. And it makes Clarice, with her way of like smelling things and looking at things and staying up all night just to watch the sunrise, it makes her seem so radical.
She really is. Like, she represents a conscious rejection of that kind of passive consumption. She's actively engaging with the world, asking questions, seeking out new experiences. And through her interactions with Montag, I think she's reminding us that this kind of engagement, this thirst for knowledge, for experience, it's essential if you want to live a life that's actually meaningful.
And speaking of different perspectives, we also have those critical responses to Fahrenheit 451. What did they have to say? What did they find particularly interesting about the book?
The critical reception, it was overwhelmingly positive. It really seemed to resonate with people, even those who weren't necessarily, science fiction fans. Kingsley Amis, I think it was, called Bradbury, the Louis Armstrong of science fiction. Like, his work just transcended the genre.
I love that.
It did. And Orville Prescott, he said that Bradbury could bring the future closer to the reader than most writers can bring the present.
Mhm.
Like, he recognized that Bradbury wasn't just building these worlds, just for the sake of it. He was tapping into something very real about the anxieties of his time.
And I think those anxieties, those fears about censorship, conformity, the power of technology, they're even more relevant today, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's like Bradbury was holding up a mirror, not just to his own time, but to ours as well. So, for our listener who's journeyed with us through this dystopian world, what's the most important thing to take away from Fahrenheit 451?
I think it's this: never be afraid to question, to challenge, to really engage with the world around you. Don't let yourself get lulled into that state of just passive consumption, whether it's by technology, by the media, by whatever.
Be like Clarisse. Be curious, be engaged, be willing to be a little strange, a little different. Embrace the power and the responsibility that comes with knowledge,
Mhm.
and never, ever underestimate the power of a good book and the conversations that they spark.
Because ultimately, it's those conversations, those acts of sharing, of questioning, of connecting that remind us what it means to be human, even in a world that often feels, well, dehumanizing.